I'm Jess, and it's so great to be with you for a few moments today. Welcome to Kingston Standard Church, our online version. I'd love to invite you to connect with us online or in person. If you're in the Kingston area, come on out. We would love to see you. If you're limited to online connection though, not a problem. Just be sure to check out our website for at-home worship resources. But in the description box of this video, you're going to find the link to our website. As well, you can always follow us on YouTube and like us on Facebook, and be sure to subscribe to both so that you'll stay up to date on all the new content when it's posted. We have a variety of resources available to families and kids on both Facebook and YouTube, so if this is your first time joining us, or if you've been here before, we want to encourage you to go ahead and check that out, because our mission is to equip families for the conversations that they have together to learn and grow and follow Jesus. And if you want to touch base personally, then feel free to reach out. You can send us a message on Facebook, or you can use the address below. So let's dive in and see what we're going to learn about today.
So back a few years ago, there was a group of us meeting in this downtown hotel in Toronto. And the reason we were there is we were planning some of the agenda for a particular conference that was going to happen in that hotel that was coming up in a number of months. We were responsible for the large group sessions, and so we were meeting in the hotel and kind of checking things out, doing some of the site inspection that was needed as we got ready for this big event. While we're meeting, outside our hotel, about every 5 or 10 minutes, there's a helicopter going by. And so, of course, it catches our curiosity. And so we kind of look out the window and see what's going on. And we realize that there's a number of lights out there and there's people lined up down the street. And we're like, I wonder what's going on. We maybe better take a break and go check this out, because now that we know something is going on and we're hearing this helicopter, I mean, it's distracting us from being able to do what we actually came to do. So what we did is, when we went outside, we started talking to some people that there was a movie being filmed in that stretch of the downtown core. And so it was an actor that we had known for quite a number of years. And one of the nights we're out there, they're filming this incredible stunt sequence with Formula One cars spinning out right in front of us. And the next night we get a chance to see the primary actor in the movie. I mean, it was just such a cool memory, and we're so glad we decided we would go outside and check this out. And we still got our work done, but I mean, we're so glad we didn't miss that moment. You know, interruptions are some of the things we're exploring today. And in general, we try and avoid them as much as we can, right? I mean, there are some interruptions that we may need to make the time to adjust, when they happen in our families, or sometimes, in our workplace. There are certain ones that we have to pay attention to, or, when opportunities come up, we have to decide whether or not we're going to engage. There are so many other settings where interruptions happen, and how we manage them are oftentimes a result of the way we tend to approach life. It's always more convenient for us to just try and stay on track, but in our case, in that particular setting, we took the risk of an interruption, and we discovered much more than we would have expected. And I think the account of Christmas has a group of people that are maybe in a similar situation. They adjusted to what God was doing as he was interrupting them in their journey, interrupting their agenda. And as we read on in the account, things get kind of messy. But what we witness is this huge payoff. Now, on the other hand, as we kind of sniff around in this particular part of the account today, we're also going to see some people who didn't take the time to be inconvenienced. And it's amazing to consider what they missed. We're looking in Matthew chapter 2, starting in verses 1 through 18. And this is a familiar part of the story, Matthew's account of Jesus being born and some of the people who showed up in this. And we're going to see some incredible glimpses of faith. And I trust our familiarity with the story, again, won't cause us to miss what we can discover about Jesus here. It says in verse 1, Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. About that time, some wise men from eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose, and we have come to worship him." Now, when you think about it, this is a pretty incredible moment. Sometimes we think about this as three kings or magi. The Bible talks about three gifts, but it never really talks about the number that are a part of this group, this entourage that show up and start asking this question. I mean, this is a group of people who probably would have been pretty important in their own country. I mean, they would have been students of many academic disciplines, astronomy and history, and even some discovery of prophecies and so on. Some of the scholars, as they kind of debate over what it is that these guys were into, they recognize that they may have even acquired the Hebrew scriptures during the Israeli exile in Babylon. But most would agree that, this journey from where they were to where they show up here in Matthew is at least months, maybe even as much as 2 years after Jesus' birth. By now, Mary and Joseph, they were out of the cave and they were in some kind of a house in the area. But don't miss this. These folks saw something in the sky and they followed it. And they believed it predicted the birth of someone important. These intellectuals pursue something that makes very little sense. If we were listening to them in our day, we probably would think of them as crazy. Maybe we'd think they'd watched too many gossip headlines. Maybe we'd think that they'd lost it. But there was really, as we see here, no messy inconvenience that was too great for them to pursue what they were looking for, what they were searching for, to follow this interruption that had been part of their lives. If you figure it's at least a 1,200 kilometer, maybe even up to 1,600 kilometer journey, depending on what part of the east that they were coming from. It would have been over difficult terrain. There would have been suspicious local residents they would have passed on the way, deserts and water hazards and various military outposts along the way. Some would have been friendly and some not so friendly. The logistics of organizing this kind of a resource base for a trip like this, it must have been huge. When you think about it, it wasn't just 3 people on 3 different camels. There would have been an entourage of servants and security and so on. You can understand how this significant group showing up would lead to what we see Matthew sharing with us next. In verse 3, it says, King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, as was everyone in Jerusalem. All Jerusalem was disturbed by them showing up. The caravan would have created quite a stir in their city, right? He called a meeting of the leading priests in verse 4 and teachers of the religious law and asked, "Where is the Messiah supposed to be born?" "In Bethlehem in Judea," they said, "for this is what the prophet wrote. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not least among the ruling cities of Judah, for a ruler will come from you who will be the shepherd for my people Israel." Now just watch how Herod deals with this. Verse 7 says, "Then Herod called for a private meeting with the wise men, and he learned from them the time when the star first appeared. Then he told them, 'Go to Bethlehem and search carefully for the child, and when you find him, come back and tell me so that I can go worship him too.'" Herod is curious at the very least, right? But not curious enough to be inconvenienced here. This is happening in his own backyard. And he says, "You've been following this important star for months, maybe even a couple of years. I just find this a little off-putting today. It's disturbing, maybe a bit threatening, but I'm not going to change my current plans to investigate this Messiah thing any further." Verse 9 continues and says, "After the interview, the wise men went their way, and the star they had seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem. It went ahead of them and stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were filled with joy. They entered the house and saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him." And they opened their treasure chests and gave him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. They persevered, and they found what they were searching for. Have you ever noticed how, following Jesus, faith in Jesus and trusting him is a lot like that? Sometimes it can involve an extravagant inconvenience, but it has a huge payoff. And there is tremendous beauty in this moment. Like, on the one hand, we appreciate how God reached out to this group of people who are outside of Israel. And we've talked a little bit about the shepherds, how they were even outsiders, but these folks were really outsiders. But very curiously as well, God spoke to these people in a language they could understand. I mean, the stars and their studies, and he used their language to draw them to himself. In the account of the Nativity, I mean, there's the involvement of ordinary people like Mary and Joseph, and as we mentioned, the invitation to these outcast shepherds, and the miraculous reality of this moment is how God is always drawing people to himself in a way that they can understand. There are so many beautiful statements in this, in the way God works in the account of Jesus' birth, and perhaps we could even say that there are interruptions here that are part of God's invitation. I've shared this with some of you before. There's a time when I was working in another setting, and there was a fishing expedition that was going to go out on a tidal set of waters, and it was an invitation that, within 4 hours, if you can kind of fill this spot, could you just jump in, and we're going to go shark fishing. And so I was like, wow, that sounds really awesome, but I'm not sure that I can leave in 4 hours. I mean, I've got this other appointment here that I've been waiting for such a long time to actually be able to make that appointment, and I've got these things at home, and I'm not sure that I can adjust. I want to, but I ended up saying no. It was an overnight excursion out on the water just because of the way the tides worked, and so the next day, when they were scheduled to be back, they weren't back. And so they had a problem with their returning, but we heard that they were okay because of the way the tides worked. They were delayed in their return, and when they did finally, land, the local news was there. Because that excursion that I could have been on caught the largest shark in that body of water's history. Now, I could have been on that trip. How was I supposed to know? If I'd made some adjustments, I could have experienced it myself, but I didn't go with the inconvenience. I kind of walked away. What I missed. As we continue to look at the account of Jesus, I wonder if Herod ever felt that way. We want to circle back to him, and he chose not to check things out. Matthew helps pull back the curtain on some of his nefarious motives, but he sees this child as a threat to his royal legacy, so he behaved like any other ruler of the day would. I mean, he protected his own interests, looking out for his family line in the process. And not only does he miss the whole point in that part of the journey, he becomes the antagonist of the story, bringing indescribable pain. You may actually be familiar with this part of the account. In verse 12, it continues, when it was time to leave, the wise men, returned to their own country by another route, for God had warned them in a dream not to return to Herod. So after the wise men were gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, flee to Egypt with the child and his mother, the angel said. Stay there until I tell you to return, because Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. And that night, Joseph left for Egypt with the child and Mary, his mother, and they stayed there until Herod's death. This fulfilled what the Lord had spoken through the prophet, I called my son out of Egypt. Just as a little aside here, in the middle of this, many people have kind of wondered different times, maybe you've even wondered, what happened to the gold and the frankincense and the myrrh that was given to Jesus and his family here in this account? Some have surmised, maybe in a bit of a quest for the Holy Grail, so to speak, right? That maybe even some of that gold is still out there. But the question that many of the scholars kind of look for is how God provided for Mary and Joseph before they even realized what they needed. The escape to Egypt would have been fully funded through some of these gifts and by such a unique means of providing and taking care of their needs before Mary and Joseph even knew they needed. I mean, isn't that just so incredibly cool? Verse 16 continues, Herod was furious when he realized that the wise men had outwitted him, and so he sent his soldiers to kill all the boys in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old and under, based on the wise men's report of the star's first appearance. Herod's brutal action fulfilled what God had spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A cry was heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning. Rachel weeps for her children, refusing to be comforted, for they are no more. Here is this wonderful opportunity to connect with the King of Kings. But it becomes this dark moment caused by Herod's protectionism. And it leads to this indescribable pain we just read about. I mean, Herod's response, and I would suggest, may not have been as much a rejection of the Messiah or Jesus in particular. It wasn't as personal as that. It was just really like Herod protecting his status quo, keeping things predictable in his own line of succession. Neat and tidy, so to speak. He didn't want any messes in his kingdom, but it's kind of ironic how much of a mess he made in the middle of it. This is a rather incredible contrast of responses that we see here in this passage. On the one hand, the interruption of God and the response of the Magi to choose to follow and end up living for God's story. This extravagant yes that they say to God's reaching out, to hearing him in their own language. And they connected with him right where they were, and they followed the star. And even before they had everything figured out, even before they totally understood what they were getting into, they decided there was no inconvenience that was too great. The study that it took to unravel the mysterious puzzle in the sky, that was worth it. The extravagant gifts, that was worth it. The reorganizing of their life for this months-long, maybe even years-long trip, they've just got to get there. And they accepted the invitation in their lives to receive God's interruption. And it became a critical part of God's story as a result. What we see here is, like, when we live for God's story, people often embrace a moment of messy inconvenience to receive a lifetime of relevance. And the true relevance that they were actually seeking for the Magi was this wild and crazy journey to experience Jesus. And the way we see them as a result is we call them wise. And then on the other hand, God reaches out to Herod. He brings people right to his doorstep whom he could respect. I mean, the Magi are in his social world, so to speak. God didn't use the shepherds to reach out to Herod. The Magi arrive on his doorstep. He has a chance to acknowledge the birth of Jesus in his own backyard, but Herod rejects this interruption of his own status quo as the invitation to live in God's story and chooses to live for his own story. I mean, he's got things to do. He's got his own plans this week, his agenda, his schedule. He's got his way of seeing the world, and he's not ready to change his plans. And in his mind, what he's doing is keeping things neat and tidy. So Herod stays in a comfortable place. There was no inconvenience that was acceptable. I mean, he even said, you go and find him, and then let me know where he is. He didn't even send somebody with them. No response was over the top when it came down to protecting Herod's agenda, as we saw toward the end of the passage. I mean, it included this edict to destroy all these young boys as a perceived threat. What we see here is that when we live for our story, what we do is we guard a moment of convenience to receive a lifetime of missed opportunities. So in the end, Herod is just another selfish king. We may even consider him to be foolish, really. And we see this as a theme in Scripture. God speaks our language, he gets our attention, and his indescribable love reaches to us. And will we make room for the messy inconvenience of following him? I would suggest in a moment like this, most of us really want to make that room, but it's a lot easier for us to say we want to honor God as long as he doesn't mess with the way we think things should go. These characters that we've shared today, the Magi and Herod and even beyond, I mean, they may seem kind of extreme to us. And we may feel like our choices are so much smaller by comparison. But in truth, all of our decisions continue to carry us in a direction, don't they? And over time, they end up charting the course of our lives. So in this account, as well as in our account of life, one response embraces Jesus and is honored as wise, and the other passes over him and is completely forgettable, and we have the opportunity to choose. If we choose to live, so to speak, for the story of Jesus, it could get messy, maybe even inconvenient. But as we see here in this account, it's oh so wise. If we choose to live for our own story, our own agenda, we can be sure that our story will be forgettable and maybe even create significant pain in the process. To respond to the invitation or ignore the interruption is a choice we all make. So as we consider that today, and as we look toward the new year, and as we consider what God may be asking us to be part of, the invitation that he is extending to us that may look like an interruption. Can you recall a time when you chose your own preference over engaging with the story of Jesus? And in the larger picture of life, as you look back on it now, how did that go? And what situations or challenges might make the story of Jesus just too inconvenient for you to follow? And maybe even a question like, where do you sense God's invitation pointing you toward living out the story of Jesus as you approach this new year? I'd like to take a moment and pray with you, and I trust that as each day continues to come, that the small decisions that we make will continue to be affirmed as decisions that are in the role and the routine of following through on the invitation of Jesus to connect with him. Sometimes it feels like an interruption, but if we follow through, God says, through his story, the change in our status moves from foolish to wise. And we all want that. Nobody wants to miss that. Let's pray. Jesus, we're grateful to you for your goodness to us and the fact that you allow us to be invited into your story. And we thank you for the way that you invited the Magi into your story and how we see their response, and how you invited Herod into your story and we grieve his response. And so, God, I pray that you'd help us to respond more like the Magi, to be willing to be interrupted, to be inconvenienced for the sake of your story. We long to live that way on a consistent basis. We know that the decisions we make on a day-to-day basis are taking us in a direction. And so I pray that in moments like this and even beyond, that you help us to evaluate where some of those decisions are carrying us. And we thank you and we praise you. In your name I pray. Amen.
Thanks again for joining us today. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channels, or if you're watching this on Facebook, then you can like and follow us there. And it would mean so much to us if you took a moment to comment, like, and share this video so that others are able to enjoy it as well. And hey, if you're in the Kingston area, come on out. We would love to see you. Please know though that you are loved and that we're praying for you. And we certainly appreciate your prayers too. We'll see you soon.